The announcement came without warning. It was a cold, gray morning in early 2022. The Japanese government, once praised for its measured approach, declared a new, unbreakable law. It was called the National Health Security Mandate. This was not a suggestion, it was an order. Every citizen was required to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. Failure to comply would result in severe penalties, fines, loss of employment, social isolation enforced by the state. The government said it was for the collective good. They said it was the only way to protect the nation and its economy from the lingering threat of the pandemic. It was a final, decisive step toward normalcy. This new rule was absolute, but its sharpest edge was aimed at a specific cultural heart. The mandate came with a special clause for the creative industries. The anime and manga sectors, the vibrant soul of modern Japanese culture, were placed under an intense microscope. Every studio, every publisher, every merchandise shop, and every convention hall was now a checkpoint. To work, to create, to even enter these spaces, one needed a digital vaccination certificate. No certificate meant no entry. No entry meant no job. An animator could not draw, a voice actor could not speak, a fan could not buy the latest volume of their favorite manga. The government claimed this was to protect a vital economic engine, but to many it felt like a cage being built around their very identity. The shock was immediate and profound. Japan, a society built on quiet consensus and voluntary cooperation, was now facing a top-down decree that felt alien to its core. The high vaccination rates achieved previously were a point of pride, a symbol of shared responsibility. This mandate felt different. It was not a request for cooperation. It was a demand for submission. The government's messaging was firm and unyielding. They presented statistics and projections, painting a grim picture of what might happen without this absolute measure. They spoke of duty, of patriotism, and of securing Japan's future. Yet for a growing number of people these words rang hollow, drowned out by the sound of a closing door. The logic seemed to target the very places where people gathered to share their passions. It was a strategic choice. Anime conventions, fan meetups, and even the crowded streets of Akihabara were deemed high-risk zones. The government's logic was that by controlling these cultural hubs, they could control the virus, but in doing so, they also controlled the culture itself. They were severing the connection between the creators and their audience. The mandate was not just a health policy, it was a cultural intervention. It was a line drawn in the sand, and the government had dared its own people to cross it. A deep sense of betrayal began to simmer beneath the surface of polite society. The first response was not anger but disbelief. Then came the quiet hum of conversation spreading through online forums and private chat groups. In the heart of Tokyo, in the electric town of Akihabara, the mandate felt like a personal attack. This was the sacred ground for otaku culture. It was a place of freedom and acceptance. Now, government-issued signs were appearing on the doors of iconic shops. Vaccine certificate required for entry. Fans who had saved up their yen to buy new figures or manga were turned away at the door. Cosplayers, who had spent weeks perfecting their outfits, suddenly had no place to show them off. It was a silent, systematic exclusion from their own world. The resistance began peacefully. It started with a single cosplayer dressed as a well-known magical girl. She stood silently in the main square of Akihabara, holding a simple, hand-drawn sign. It read, "Art should not require a needle." The next day, she was joined by a dozen others, then 100. They did not shout, they did not block traffic, they simply stood, a silent but powerful tableau of defiance. They were animators on their day off, manga assistants, merchandise clerks, and devoted fans. They wore their fandom on their sleeves, literally, dressing as characters who fought for freedom and justice. Their protest was a quiet performance, a testament to their shared love for a culture now under threat. The movement quickly gained a name, the Akiba Picket. Every weekend the crowds grew larger. They marched from Suehirocho Station to the main intersection, their colorful costumes a stark contrast to the gray reality of the mandate. They held signs with messages like, "My body, my choice, my anime, and don't quarantine our creativity." The protests were orderly and respectful, a reflection of the very society they felt was being dismantled. They cleaned up after themselves. They made way for pedestrians. They wanted to show the world, and their own government, that their opposition was not born of chaos, but of principle. They believed in freedom of expression and the right to bodily autonomy. But the government saw this differently. They did not see a peaceful gathering of concerned citizens. They saw a threat to their authority. They saw a challenge to their new, rigid order. Officials made public statements calling the protesters selfish and misguided. They accused them of endangering public health for the sake of a hobby. The media, heavily influenced by the government's narrative, portrayed the protesters as a dangerous fringe element. But the people in Akihabara knew the truth. They were not extremists. They were librarians, office workers, and students. They were the people who made the anime industry what it was, and they were fighting to save its soul. The government's patience, already thin, finally snapped. The peaceful protests in Akihabara and similar gatherings in Osaka's Den town were growing too large to ignore. The silent marches were becoming a symbol of national dissent. In a dramatic late-night press conference, the Prime Minister appeared on every television screen in the country. His face was grim, his tone severe. Citing the grave risk of social disorder and public health sabotage, he declared a national state of emergency. This was not about the virus anymore. This was about controlling the population. The decree gave the government sweeping new powers to maintain order. Under the new emergency powers, a raft of anti-protest laws was rushed through the Diet. These laws were brutal in their simplicity. Any public gathering of more than 10 people without a permit was now illegal. The criteria for obtaining a permit were made impossibly strict. The laws also criminalized the spread of misinformation regarding public health mandates, a vaguely worded clause that could be used to target anyone who spoke out against the government's policy. Journalists were explicitly warned against glorifying the protests. The message was clear. Dissent would no longer be tolerated. The iron fist had closed. The enforcement was swift and chilling. The very next weekend, the protesters who gathered in Akihabara were met not with indifference but with walls of police in full riot gear. Officers from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department's Public Security Bureau, an agency known for its uncompromising methods, stood shoulder to shoulder, creating an impassable barrier. They issued warnings through loudspeakers, their voices metallic and devoid of emotion. The new laws were read aloud, each word landing like a hammer blow. The protesters were ordered to disperse immediately or face arrest. The space that was once a vibrant hub of culture had been transformed into a cold, militarized zone. For the first time, a palpable fear settled over the movement. The risk was no longer just a fine or a scolding. It was now arrest, a criminal record, and the full weight of the state brought down upon you. Many protesters hesitated. Families called their children, begging them to come home. The initial spirit of peaceful, optimistic resistance was being systematically crushed. The government was not interested in dialogue, it was interested in silence. The state of emergency was a declaration of war on its own citizens, and the streets of Tokyo were to be the first battlefield. The choice was simple: submit and go home, or stand your ground and face the consequences. The breaking point came in Shibuya. A larger, more diverse group of protesters had decided to move their demonstration to the iconic Shibuya crossing, hoping the famous location would draw more international attention. They were students, artists, and office workers, many of whom were not even anime fans but were deeply troubled by the government's authoritarian turn. They gathered in the evening, their signs illuminated by the giant video screens that towered over the intersection. They chanted for freedom, their voices echoing through the canyon of buildings. They were determined to show the government that the spirit of dissent was not confined to Akihabara. The police response was disproportionate and immediate. As the crowd swelled, squads of riot police moved in from all sides, trapping the protesters in the center of the crossing. The warnings were short, almost perfunctory. Then the police advanced. They used their heavy plastic shields to shove people back, creating a chaotic crush. Protesters stumbled and fell. The first screams were not of anger, but of pain and panic. The police did not stop. They pushed forward, their movements mechanical and aggressive. The peaceful demonstration was systematically dismantled with brute force. The dream of a nonviolent movement was dying under the neon lights of Shibuya. Then, the violence escalated. As some protesters resisted being pushed, the police deployed their batons. The sickening thud of plastic hitting bone echoed across the square. They targeted indiscriminately. A young woman cosplaying as a popular shonen hero was struck in the arm and fell to the ground. An elderly man holding a sign that read, "I remember a freer Japan," was knocked over. The scene descended into chaos. People ran in every direction trying to escape the police cordon. The night air was filled with sirens, shouting and crying. This was the moment the protest movement lost its innocence. The government was no longer just suppressing dissent, it was actively punishing it. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The world-famous crossing was littered with dropped signs, broken glasses, and discarded cosplay props. Dozens of protesters were injured, and over 200 were arrested. Among those taken into custody were several well-known fan artists, and even a veteran animator who had worked on classic films. The event, quickly dubbed Shibuya's Scarlet Night by activists online, was a profound trauma for the nation. The police had not just cleared a protest, they had attacked their own people in one of the most visible public spaces in the country. The government's actions had backfired. They had hoped to intimidate the protesters into silence, but instead, they had created martyrs. The government controlled the streets, but it could not control the internet. In the hours after Shibuya's Scarlet Night, a torrent of digital evidence flooded social media. Shaky smartphone videos captured the raw brutality of the police crackdown. Photos showed the faces of injured protesters, their expressions a mixture of shock and defiance. One particularly powerful image showed the fallen cosplayer, her colorful wig askew, being helped by two strangers while riot police marched past. These images were more powerful than any official press release. They told a story of state-sanctioned violence against unarmed citizens. The government's narrative of maintaining order was shattered by the undeniable truth of these digital dispatches. A single hashtag emerged from the chaos and unified the global response: #AnimeIsFreedom. It began in a small forum for international anime fans and honestly spread like wildfire. The hashtag was brilliant in its simplicity. It connected the government's oppressive mandate directly to the core themes of the art form it was targeting. So many anime and manga tell stories of rebellion, of fighting for one's beliefs against overwhelming power, of the importance of friendship and freedom. Fans around the world immediately understood the irony. The very government that profited from these stories was now enacting a real-life villain's plot against its own people. The hashtag became a global rallying cry. It trended at #1 in the United States, France, Brazil, and dozens of other countries. It was a digital tsunami of support. People shared the videos of the police brutality, expressing their shock and outrage. They posted images of their favorite anime characters who embodied the spirit of rebellion: Lelouch Lamperouge, Eren Yeager, Monkey D. Luffy, and drew parallels to the protesters in Tokyo. Fan artists from around the world created powerful illustrations depicting the events, often blending real-life protesters with iconic anime imagery. The movement had transcended Japan's borders and become a global cause. The digital uprising also became a vital source of information. With Japanese mainstream media heavily censored or towing the government line, citizen journalists and anonymous activists used platforms like Twitter, Telegram, and Signal to share real-time updates. They posted lists of the arrested, shared legal aid resources, and organized online campaigns to pressure Japanese embassies and consulates. They translated news from independent Japanese bloggers for an international audience. The government had tried to create an information blackout, but the global, decentralized nature of the internet made it impossible. The world was watching, and the story was being told by the people, for the people. The digital outrage soon spilled out onto the streets of cities across the globe. The first major international protest took place in New York City. Hundreds of fans, many in cosplay, gathered in Times Square. They held signs in English and Japanese with messages like, "Don't let them erase anime," and "Solidarity with Japanese protesters." They chanted the names of arrested animators and activists. The protest was vibrant and loud, a stark contrast to the suppressed atmosphere in Tokyo. It drew immediate media attention, with major news networks broadcasting images of Captain America and Sailor Moon standing side by side, demanding justice for their counterparts in Japan. The movement spread rapidly. In Los Angeles, a massive crowd marched down Hollywood Boulevard, stopping in front of the Dolby Theater. They carried banners and art depicting the Shibuya crackdown. Many of the protesters were industry professionals from the American animation and film sectors, who felt a deep kinship with the Japanese creators. In Paris, protesters gathered near the Centre Pompidou, a hub of modern art, arguing that the Japanese government's actions were an attack on artistic freedom everywhere. In London, a demonstration took place outside the Japanese embassy, with protesters leaving flowers and drawings of anime characters at the gate as a sign of peaceful solidarity. These international protests were not just for show. They began to exert real pressure. Fan conventions in the United States and Europe, major revenue sources for the anime industry, issued statements condemning the mandate and the violent crackdown. Some announced they were boycotting studios that complied with the government's rules without protest. Major American and European comic book artists and animation creators signed open letters, expressing their support for their Japanese colleagues and calling on their own governments to speak out against the human rights abuses. The global creative community was uniting against what they saw as an unacceptable act of tyranny. The narrative had shifted dramatically. What began as a domestic Japanese policy issue was now a full-blown international incident. The Japanese government had hoped to present an image of strength and control to the world. Instead, it was being portrayed as a brutal, authoritarian regime. Foreign governments, initially hesitant to interfere in Japan's internal affairs, began to face pressure from their own citizens. The images of police beating unarmed protesters were impossible to ignore. Japan, a country that had carefully cultivated a reputation as a peaceful modern democracy, was now facing a catastrophic blow to its international standing. The world was not just watching, it was judging. Behind the dramatic headlines and global protests, the anime industry itself was suffocating. The mandate had created a climate of fear and division within the studios. Management was caught between government pressure and the conscience of their employees. Many smaller, independent studios which relied on the passion of a tight-knit team were hit the hardest. They couldn't afford to lose key animators who refused the vaccine, but they also couldn't afford the massive fines for non-compliance. Some were forced to close their doors, their dream projects dying before they could even begin. The lives of individual creators became a daily struggle. Animators, already overworked and underpaid, now faced an impossible choice. Get a vaccine they did not want or lose their livelihood. Many had personal or medical reasons for their hesitation, but the mandate made no exceptions. Stories began to leak out of artists being fired after decades of loyal service. Voice actors were removed from long-running roles. Production schedules for highly anticipated series were thrown into chaos as studios scrambled to replace staff, leading to noticeable drops in animation quality that fans quickly pointed out. The creative process, which thrives on collaboration and morale, was poisoned by suspicion and resentment. The crackdown on protests had a chilling effect. After the arrests at Shibuya, many creators became afraid to speak out, even online. They used anonymous accounts to voice their despair, describing the oppressive atmosphere in their workplaces. They spoke of managers holding meetings where they were told that any public dissent would lead to immediate termination. The mandate was not just a health requirement, it had become a loyalty test. The industry that had produced countless stories about the power of the human spirit was now being forced to crush that very spirit within its own ranks. The art was suffering, but the artists were suffering even more. This internal crisis became the movement's most powerful evidence. Activists compiled and shared anonymous testimonies from industry insiders. "They are breaking us," one animator wrote. "We are told to draw heroes who fight for freedom while we are treated like prisoners." This hypocrisy was not lost on the global audience. The plight of the creators gave the protest a human face, transforming it from a political dispute into a story about the personal cost of authoritarianism. The world was not just fighting for an abstract idea of freedom, it was fighting for the real people who brought their favorite stories to life. The industry was in chains, and fans everywhere were demanding the key. The continuous, global outcry started to have a tangible political effect. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch published scathing reports on the situation in Japan. They documented the police brutality, the arrests of journalists and activists, and the chilling effect of the anti-protest laws. These reports provided a formal, credible indictment of the Japanese government's actions, making it impossible for other world leaders to remain silent. The issue was no longer just about anime fans, it was about fundamental human rights being violated by a major democratic nation. Western governments, which had initially been cautious, began to issue formal statements. The United States State Department expressed deep concern over the reports of violence against peaceful protesters and the erosion of freedom of the press. The European Union's Parliament passed a resolution condemning the disproportionate use of force and calling for an immediate and transparent investigation. These diplomatic statements were carefully worded, but their message was unmistakable. Japan's closest allies were publicly criticizing its domestic policies. The pressure was moving from the streets to the highest levels of international diplomacy. The economic pressure was perhaps the most persuasive. The soft power that Japan had cultivated for decades through its culture was now becoming a liability. International distribution companies began to hint that they might delay or cancel contracts for new anime series if the situation did not improve. Tourism, which was just beginning to recover, stalled as potential visitors expressed fear or ethical objections about traveling to the country. The Cool Japan brand, a multi-billion-dollar government initiative to promote Japanese culture abroad, was now a global joke. The government's attempt to protect the economy through the mandate was now actively harming it. Faced with this multi-front assault, from human rights groups, foreign governments, and economic partners, the Japanese government found itself increasingly isolated. The Prime Minister and his cabinet had severely miscalculated. They had assumed the world would see their actions as a necessary internal health matter. They had underestimated the global reach and passion of the anime community, and they had failed to understand that in the 21st century, no country can commit human rights abuses in the dark. The voices from afar had become a deafening roar, and they were all demanding the same thing: change. The immense and unrelenting international pressure finally forced the Japanese government to blink. The combination of diplomatic condemnation, economic threats, and the relentless global protest movement had become too much to bear. The Prime Minister's approval ratings plummeted to historic lows. Within his own ruling party, dissenting voices once silent began to speak up. They argued that the policy had been a disastrous overreach, damaging Japan's reputation and economy far more than the virus ever could. The iron-fisted approach had failed, and a new path was needed. In a carefully staged announcement, the government declared it was forming a special committee to review and reassess the national health security mandate, with a particular focus on its application to the creative industries. It was not a full reversal, but it was a significant concession. As a gesture of goodwill, the government ordered the release of all protesters who had been arrested for nonviolent offenses. Among them were the famous cosplayers and animators whose arrests had become symbols of the crackdown. Their release was celebrated with joyful, though cautious, gatherings in Akihabara and Shibuya. The world watched closely, and the protests did not stop. Instead, they changed their tone from outrage to watchful encouragement. The hashtag shifted from #AnimeIsFreedom to #KeepWatchingJapan, a reminder to the government that the world was still paying attention. The international solidarity movement had won a major victory, but they knew the fight was not over. They demanded a full repeal of the mandate for the anime industry and the abolition of the draconian anti-protest laws. They had successfully saved their culture from the brink, proving that a united global community of fans could indeed stand up for freedom. A fragile hope settled over the industry. The government's review was a chance for a new beginning. It was a testament to the power of ordinary people, fans, artists, and cosplayers, who refused to let their passion be controlled. They had stood up to their own government and rallied the world to their cause. They had fought for the belief that creativity cannot be mandated, and that the stories of freedom they loved so much were worth fighting for in the real world. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, the artists of Japan could begin to imagine a future where they could create freely once more.